Good morning. If I can ask you to all take your seats, I think we're ready to get started for the second day of our conference, California and the Future of Environmental Law and Policy. I'm Simi Payne. I'm the Associate Director of California Center, and Associate Director, I can now say, now that we have Steve Weissman as our second Associate Director of the California Center for Environmental Law and Policy, and I'm the Director of our Global Commons Project. The theme of the conference is California's leadership role in environmental law and policy. And one of the characteristics that makes California a global leader is the optimism and confidence that we have in the ability of technology and intelligence to help us out of some of the most difficult problems that we face. One of the greatest strengths that we feel we have at the center here is our ability to collaborate with our colleagues in other disciplines at the Berkeley campus, which is the world's leading campus in international science and technology. And when we face a challenge like the one posed to us by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 20 to 40% in the next 18 years, we realize that we will need, the next 12 years, less time, we will need a major multidisciplinary initiative to create sustainable, carbon-neutral sources of energy. We are very fortunate that that is exactly the mission of this morning's plenary speaker and the institute that he runs. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephen Chu, the director of the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and professor of physics, molecular, and cell biology at Berkeley. He received his doctoral degree in physics from Berkeley and then began a remarkable career at Bell Labs and at Stanford before returning here to this campus. For his discovery that by laser cooling, he could trap atoms, he received the Nobel Prize in 1997 for physics. Dr. Chu's leadership was instrumental in bringing the Energy and Biosciences Institute to the Berkeley campus. This, as most of you will know, is the collaboration with BP, the energy company, and UC Berkeley and University of Illinois. And they have a goal of developing the fields of synthetic biology, nanotechnology, and ultimately to develop sustainable, clean fuel sources. He has many other honors and achievements. Those are noted in your conference program, and I would like to give the floor so that we can hear what Dr. Chu is actually doing rather than recite those honors. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Chu.
Thank you. Thank you. You just saw before your very eyes the nearly just-in-time way I live my life. Anyway, I want to talk about the global energy and climate change problem, give you a glimpse of partly what the problem is, although I'm sure all of you know many of these aspects, and solutions. I think the law and policy is very important in helping solve the problems. This will not be solved by technology alone, so everybody needs to pitch in. There are many aspects to the energy problem, depending on who you are. Some people feel the most serious aspect is our oil dependency. Others feel that increasing costs of energy are threatening the worldwide economy, and their environmental aspects. And for me, I think the environmental aspects are the ones, in my mind, that trump all else. I'm not going to go into the evidence of why we think what we're seeing is caused by humans, but we are certainly seeing things that are happening, and I won't dwell on too many of the predictions. But let me just talk about one. There's a prediction of increased water shortages in the world and in the United States. But since we're in California, let me talk about a prediction that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, 2004. And it says, what will happen if we can keep the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent below 500 parts per million? That's the so-called B1 scenario. We right now have 380 parts per million today if carbon dioxide, but 420 parts per million carbon dioxide equivalent. Before the Industrial Revolution, we had 275 parts per million. And so 500 is very optimistic, and most of us don't think we will achieve this goal. If you take one of the business as usual paths, it goes considerably over 600 parts per million. Let's talk about the alpine subalpine forests that constitute much of the watershed in California. This prediction says in this century, 21st century, half to 3/4 of those forests will be gone. Sierra snowpack will decrease on a steady state average basis, 30 to 70%, and in business as usual, it's mostly gone. Now, that was published in 2004. The climate models were done probably in 2002, 2003. As we refine these models, we can refine the predictions, try to take some of the uncertainty out, and there's considerable uncertainty in these predictions. The most recent ones between 2070 and 2099 says in the lower emission scenario, 27% remaining, high emission scenario, 11% remaining. But perhaps much more immediate, in the first half of this century, 2020 to 2049, we're looking at a 26% decrease in the snowpack in the lowercase scenario. Now, you all probably know what it means when we have a 26% decrease in snowpack 2 years in a row. Okay, so just stretch your imagination, think about forever, and then it gets pretty serious. And in the higher emission scenarios, we have maybe 60% remaining in the first half of the 21st century. This is not only happening in the United States, it's happening around the world. The Tibetan Plateau feeds the major rivers in Pakistan, India, the other part of Pakistan, the Yangtze River, the Yellow River in China. And the thickness of the glaciers is now shrinking at over, this is a little bit out of date, it's now about 1.4 meters per year averaged. And thousands of square miles of glacier are shrinking. Here's another prediction. This has to do with a watershed forest. There was a prediction that British Columbia would lose 78–80% of its pine forests by 2013. Now, why so fast, do you think? Because it's not really changing that much. Things are very nonlinear when you have biology involved in it, as the world does. And so what happens is the fear was that there are no more frosts in British Columbia that will kill these parasites, the pine bark beetle. And if they don't manage that population, they run amok. Now, this is what it looks like. This is dead standing pine, and this is the live stuff over here. Now, you might ask, how's this prediction fared? Is it one of these sky is falling down predictions? And so now it can be quite confusing if you go on the internet. There's all sorts of information and misinformation out there. So what I tend to do is try to look for government branches that say something, because they really can't amplify too much. So this is what I found from the British Columbia Ministry of Range and Forest and Range. This was in 2006. They said approximately 40% of the pine forests are now killed. So we're about halfway there. So the issue of whether we can allow just sort of market forces, if you will, or proper behavior fix this problem. There are some economists still out there who feel that don't worry about it, the market will take care of it. The old joke is, how many economists or free market economists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is none. If it needed changing, the free market would have taken care of it. That is not true in two grounds. One ground is if you have what's called a commons problem, a common shared resource, a common problem. In water and air pollution, there's no incentive for a city or a factory upstream way upstream to treat its water before it dumps it in the river. However, the city downstream has a real problem, and there's a huge cost in then cleaning up the water, and it would have been far more economical, orders of magnitude more economical, if everybody says we're going to contribute something and make people treat their water before they dump it into the stream. Climate change is the ultimate climate problem. And we really do need a combination of incentives to drive correct behavior, but also fiscal policies and regulations. And the most important is, of course, a price on carbon. Whether it's a tax or a cap and trade, there has to be a price. But the second most important part of that, which is actually associated with this one, is that there can't be any loopholes. And right now, the industries who feel their existence is threatened are working very hard to make sure there are safety valves and loopholes. I'd rather see a steady price increase over a 15-year period to get it up to, let's say, $30 a ton, to always write in loopholes. Once you send a very long-term price signal that this will happen, then I think what happens, and this is true of many, many areas, whether it be smog control devices like catalytic converters, seat belts, Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, is as soon as the government, both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, feel strongly about this, the lobbyists lose their influence, and the problem is turned over to the engineers, and progress is made. So, how do we solve the problem? We have to maximize energy efficiency and decrease energy use, and we have to also develop new sources of carbon neutral energy. We cannot conserve our way out of the current problem. Now, having said that, energy efficiency will remain the lowest hanging fruit. And there's a recent report published by McKinsey & Company, and in this report, they plot in a mid-range abatement curve. This is in the middle of what they thought we could do in terms of decreasing carbon emissions. So on this axis is potential decrease in carbon emissions per year in billions of tons of carbon a year. This is 3 billion tons. Just to set the scale, we are now emitting about 8 billion tons of carbon around the world. This axis is very interesting. This axis is money, and zero is here, which means there's negative money over here. What does that mean? It means if you make certain changes, you actually make money, you don't lose them. Remarkably, the areas on these curves are the same, so according to this report, it looks as though you can save on order 3 billion tons of carbon by having a cost on carbon dioxide equivalent of something on the order of, let's say here, this is 30 and this is $60 a ton of carbon dioxide. Now, this suggests that there are 20 bills lying down in streets and you just pick them up, because all that negative cost sounds pretty good. And the first thing is, well, if that's really true, why is McKinsey writing reports rather than picking up the money? You should always ask yourself that. The reason, and there's a few lines in there, there's not much, most of the report isn't about this, and this is where you guys come in, that there are issues that where the left hand and the right hand have different colors of money, different pockets of money, or different incentives. And the classical one in economic terms is called the principal agent problem. And in terms of energy efficiency, this has been generalized to the following. There's a tenant and a landlord. The landlord owns a building, the tenant rents the building. If the landlord says, I will include in my rent the cost of utilities, electricity and heat, the tenant will behave in a somewhat irresponsible manner. They will leave the windows open to get a lot of fresh air. They will turn the air conditioner on or the heat on full blast. And so the landlord really can't do that. In the meantime, if the tenant pays for the utility bills, but is just renting, there's no incentive of the tenant to put in higher efficiencies in the utilities that they won't own, the stove or the heater, or to help insulate the building, and so on. And so it's a different incentives, and they have very different incentives. So what you do is you have sustained systemic inefficiency built into the system. Similarly, builders and home buyers. If you, the McKinsey report said $1,000 more in insulation for the average, say, 3-bedroom house, in both the insulation materials and the labor, would pay for itself in less than 1 year. This is $1,000 out of a building cost of, let's say, of order $200,000. So it's really insignificant, but yet the American Home Builders Association is lobbying very strongly not to even include guidelines in any federal statute that would increase the amount of insulation in homes, to get them, for example, up to California standards. And the comment by the lobbyists was, sure, we can build more energy efficient homes, but the American homeowner doesn't want to pay for it. And these are guidelines, because guidelines are the first step in regulations. So those things continue. Now, in things of that nature, like getting the insulation standards up, I think there's only one, first of all, price is not going to be a factor because it's of scale of less than 1/10 of 1%. And so the only thing that one can do is, at some point, the American electorate has to tell their elected representatives, just roll over these guys. There's a few other times when you might want to do that because there are no choices. One was refrigerator efficiencies. In the middle 1970s, one of the physicists at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and a physics professor on campus abruptly turned his career around. He was a high-energy physicist, a very distinguished one, Enrico Fermi's last student. He left physics abruptly and said, I'm going to work on the energy problem. And he realized very quickly that energy efficiency was the lowest hanging fruit. And so he began and assembled around him a group of people that began to convince California to begin increasingly stringent refrigerator efficiency standards. And this blue curve is the amount of energy consumed per average refrigerator. And you see in 2005 it is decreased by a factor of 4, not 40%, a factor of 4. Okay? Decrease in the use of energy, even though the refrigerator size increased from 18 cubic feet in the middle 1970s to 22 cubic feet. Now you notice this kind of arching across and flattening out, and it's not really because it's asymptotically flattening out because of the size of the American stomach. It's because, or the appetite, it's because of the size of the kitchen door. And so now they're getting a little bit more clever about this. They're making wider and wider refrigerators, if you probably noticed, and the new home builders are putting a wider space for the refrigerator. So it continues. Now when the manufacturers said, oh, we're going to make these more efficient, they said this would be terrible. The homeowner can't pay for these refrigerators. It'll cost too much. It's going to be outrageous. This is the inflation-adjusted price of refrigerators. It's gone down by a factor of 2. So here again, it turned out to be regulation that did it. You might ask, why does this efficiency increase before the first standard came in? It's because they actually gave them a lead time. And again, this is a very graphic illustration. Once the engineers are assigned to the job, it's a nice thing. Is this significant? If we had the number of refrigerators today at the mid-1970 efficiency, this is how much energy we would have used. This is actually, let me say it differently, this is the refrigerator energy savings. Let's compare this to the entire renewable energy portfolio of the United States, excluding hydro. It's twice as much. Okay? This is with all the windmills and solar thermal, solar photovoltaics on our roofs today. You save twice as much by making a refrigerator 4 times more efficient, just a refrigerator. Air conditioners are a factor 2 more efficient. Heaters are a factor of maybe 40% more efficient, and so on. So California has been flat in its consumption of electricity per person since 30 years ago due to these programs. It had a lot to do with it. I don't have the time to talk about the decoupling programs of the utility companies, but you will probably notice that the utility companies in California are some of the biggest preachers of energy conservation. This is not true in most of the United States, because in most of the United States, if you sell more power, you make more money. And so the profit was decoupled from California utilities, and this has worked. Lawrence Berkeley Lab has been called upon to help design very energy efficient buildings. This is one example, the New York Times headquarters building in New York City. Modern architects believe, progressive architects believe that one can save, actually the official statement of a group of architects is that you can decrease the energy consumption in buildings by a factor of 10. I would be happy if it decreased by a factor of 4, but I don't want to debate that. How can you do this? Well, certainly you can make more energy efficient components. Most of the new buildings built today do not have incandescent lights. I think, again, a simple matter of regulation. You can decree in a few more years that no incandescent lights be put in a building. Buildings, both commercial and residential buildings, consume 39% of the energy in the United States, and it's roughly half and half. In commercial buildings, of the energy, only a quarter of it is used for space heating. 75% is electricity, and the biggest use of electricity is lights. Now, in addition to lighting, you can make better building materials, better designs, passive shading, thermal inertia, so you can design a building so it cools down at night and keeps its temperature cool during the daytime by having automatic shades, so when the sun beats on certain windows, you block that, so on and so forth. So we believe that a buildings systems approach, which integrates all of the individual devices in very much in the way that a Prius integrates the brakes, the alternator, the engine, the battery in an integrated system, and what you found in a Prius is that a factor of 2 energy savings can accrue. Because when you step on the brakes, you now charge a battery, you don't dissipate the energy in heat, and then the battery is used to start your car from a dead stop, so your engine doesn't have to idle. We believe much more building efficiencies can be achieved than a Prius. And in fact, we're beginning to talk with a number of companies. United Technologies actually approached the Berkeley Lab because they know about our reputation designing energy efficient buildings. And by the way, Congress approached Berkeley Lab and asked us to green their Capitol building. And the San Francisco Federal Building was designed in large part, the energy efficiency part was designed by Berkeley Lab. So these are additional things. Now, how much energy savings do we think we can achieve as going forward? This dotted line is business as usual. This is, again, perhaps a little overly aggressive, but it's good to have aggressive goals. In terms of decreased buildings and retrofits, by the year 2030, which is a stated goal of, I don't remember the exact name, but essentially the American Association of Architects, says that you can save this much amount of energy if you really put your mind to designing cost-effective. Cost-effective means it has to pay for itself. Those investments have to pay for itself in 5 or 10 years. This is the amount of energy you can save, and you compare that to all of nuclear electrical power generation, 20% in the US, or coal, which is about 53%. So essentially, if you do this, you don't have to build new coal plants. Let's go to renewables. This is our current energy consumption, transportation, heating, industry, whatever. And in the renewable energy slice, which is 7% today, most of it is hydroelectric. This huge biomass part is mostly people in New England burning wood to keep their homes warm. And so if we look at this renewable portfolio, we have oil and unconventional oil like tar sands. This is so valuable a commodity now that is being almost 90% diverted to transportation needs. But these other sources of energy, coal, gas, fission, and geothermal, are the baseload generation of electricity. These other things, like winds, photovoltaics, and thermal, are fine at a 5% level because the utility company doesn't really mind. You have a panel on your roof or on top of a Walmart, and you generate a lot of electricity, you put it back onto the grid. At a 1%, 5% level, even a 10% level, the grid can adjust to it. If you think about it, it's voltage and resistance determines where the current flows. So you start sticking energy back on the grid, And then automatically, the grid has to then make adjustments to the amount they generate to keep it at a steady voltage so that it flows essentially downhill to where the end users want it. But now suppose you have 25, 50% renewables, and suddenly the wind stops or a big cloud comes over. That's a big deal. We don't have the system and we don't have the technology now in place, installed to do that. Let me skip that. We know about wind. Wind is very successful. I shouldn't skip. I'll tell you one thing about wind. These very efficient wind turbines were developed in Europe due to a very stable price policy that extended over a decade. The policy in the United States was up and down like a yo-yo. And so the companies like Siemens and others said, we can't invest hundreds of millions of dollars developing a new generation of wind turbines because we don't know whether we're going to ever make money on this. And so it was Europe policy that actually allowed these companies to develop these things. They're very, very efficient. As a physicist, you can calculate the maximum amount of the kinetic energy of this moving air. You know, you can't stop all of it because the air's got to go somewhere. It's got to pass through the turbine. And it turns out that the modern wind turbines collect 5/6 of the theoretical maximum efficiency. And that theoretical maximum efficiency is based on general principles. The air has to pass through the turbine. You have to conserve momentum. You know, downstream, the pressure is going to be the same, et cetera. They're also pretty big. The current ones being installed are 126 meters in diameter. As you get longer than that, it's hard to put these blades on a railroad, flat blade, or a truck, and because these rail cars or trucks have to make turns. That's you know, more than half of a soccer field long. Here's where the wind is. This is both good news and bad news. The good news is the wind isn't where there are many people. That's the bad news. So how are you going to get, here you are in North Dakota, how are you going to get your electricity and wind over to California and over into the East Coast or even to Chicago? Currently, the United States grid system are a bunch of local roads connected in certain sections, maybe 5 or 6 sections within the United States on a more generalized grid, but then they're just patched and cobbled together. So we don't have a long-distance transmission system, and electricity generated, for example, in a hydroelectric source over here is not transported over here. The wind over here, I'm in fact on a committee, America's Energy Future, sponsored by the National Academies of Engineering and Science. I purposely put myself on one of the subpanels, electricity transmission distribution, and I was told, Steve, you know, your dream of having this long-distance, high-voltage DC network that can ship electrons across thousands of miles, which is needed if you want to have renewables, because most of the solar renewables are down in here, the wind renewables are around here, and so how are you going to ship this stuff over to the East Coast? And this person said, another person who is wise to the ways of how we ship power around, there's no way we will be shipping electrons 3,000 miles. Well, I'm more optimistic than that. I think we need to ship electrons 3,000 miles. Now, how do you ship them? Right now we have high voltage AC alternating current transmission lines, but we already know after 500 kilometers that high voltage DC is less expensive. There are technical reasons why that is, but the biggest reason is easy to explain. If you have a high voltage transmission line, it's alternating current. What's really happening is alternating between positive and negative charges on this wire. That electric field then interacts with the ground, and so you're polarizing the atoms and molecules in the ground because the electric field is oscillating back and forth. And as you do that, the so-called capacitive coupling, the electric field's coupling energy into the ground, is the predominant loss of energy. Okay? Resistivity is another loss. That's why high voltage transmission lines are so high. They're not high because you might reach up and grab it. You know, I think most people will realize after 100 feet, you're not going to reach up and grab it. Okay? With DC, you can put it under the ground. You can put it under the water. And Europe has several DC high voltage plants. actually, the first high-voltage DC line was between Sweden and Germany, which was installed 20 years ago. And they're going to be installing another line between Norway and Netherlands so people can trade energy. There's a lot of hydro resources in Norway. And in fact, if you have extra wind resources, you can use that electricity to pump water up a hill to store it. There's a hydroelectric dam in China, 2,000 kilometers, only 7% energy loss. We ship electricity 1/10 that, and we have equivalent energy loss. Okay, so there are many things policy needs to do to tweak this, to tweak the development. The local utility companies cannot pay for a high-voltage DC transmission line system that overlays on our current grid because it costs a lot of money. The estimate is, in round numbers, about $1 trillion. But the United States spent far more than that to build an international highway system in the name of national security. So, if you think about it in those terms, it actually doesn't amount to that much money. It's very dubious whether your electricity will go up by 5%, 2%, 1% by installing this long-distance transmission line system. Let me tell you a little bit about this institute. I never thought of it as an institute. We like to think of ourselves as a national laboratory. Its budget is, well, this is an old slide. Our operating budget is roughly $0.6 billion a year. Unfortunately, all the money doesn't come to me and I sprinkle it. It's comparable to the research budget of University of California, Berkeley. It's a very distinguished laboratory. 11 employees were awarded the Nobel Prize, and 9 of them actually did their work at the lab. If you count all our collaborators or people who worked there or were trained there, the number goes to 55. And the number I'm most proud of is that Lawrence Berkeley Lab trained either as students or postdocs or young career scientists 30 Nobel laureates. I was actually trained, I was a graduate student here. I was an employee, while I was a graduate student and postdoc, I was an employee at the lab. Right now, 84 members of the lab are in the National Academy of Sciences. I changed that number, if you were noticing, because one of our members died. 4 more members got elected this year. But for those of you who don't know, the membership in the National Academy of Sciences is limited to slightly over 2,000 people. So someone has to die before a new one gets elected. But right now, 4% of the membership in the National Academy of Sciences work at the lab. So it's a very distinguished laboratory, extraordinarily gifted people. 240 of our principal investigators are also members of faculties, primarily University of California, Berkeley, but some at UCSF, Davis, and other places. We, in addition to energy efficiency, when I joined the laboratory now almost 4 years ago, I said, with that intellectual horsepower, can we get some of the basic scientists to shift their careers and think about how do you harness the energy of the sun into various forms of energy like electricity and transportation fuel. Now, the reason a lot of these arrows are going to transportation fuel is because transportation fuel, although only 28% of the energy use in the United States, is a huge defining factor in our geopolitical stands and political stability. And oh, by the way, at $100 a barrel of oil and the amount we're importing today, the amount we spend on importing oil is equal to the entire discretionary federal budget in 2005. It's about $440 billion. Discretionary means you take out the Social Security and the military stuff. Well, military may or may not be discretionary, but take out the military, the Social Security, and you leave science research, keeping the Washington Monument open, you name it, everything else. It's the same. It's a big number. Why do we think transportation fuels, at least, especially for long-distance movers like airplanes and trucks, will be needed, and trains will be needed in the future? It's because of the energy density. This is the stored energy per weight. This is the stored energy per volume, and hydrocarbons in the form of transportation fuel are way up here. And this is hydrogen. It's down near 0 stored energy per volume. It's up in stored energy per weight, but you have, the best storage of hydrogen now, if you want to put it in a car, is a high-pressure tank at 5,000 to 10,000 pounds per square inch. Even if you liquefy hydrogen, as you do in the shuttle rockets, you only get an stored energy per unit volume up here, and it's about 3 to 4 times lower than a tank of gasoline. And oh, by the way, batteries are down here. So they're going to be with us, especially for airplanes, trains, and trucks for a while. Now, how do you make fuel? Well, there's a number of ways. You can try to raise enough plants and turn that into fuel. But you look at the overall limits of productivity, you find that these parts are not enough sunlight or too cold. These red parts, not enough water. And then you have the black parts that have enough water and enough sunlight. But of course, you compete with land use for raising food crops or for raising crops to feed animals. Now, even in this Mercator projection that emphasizes the north, you begin to realize around the equator there's a lot of desert. And if you take today's electricity generation in the latest generation silicon photocells, very old technology, it converts 20% of the solar energy into electricity. You need 2 to 3/10 of the desert that I just showed you to generate the current world electricity needs. So we don't have the transmission, we don't have the storage, and the sun doesn't always shine. You might need 10 times that much. So it's on order 3% of the world's desert. Why don't we do this now? It's because it costs too much. How much does it cost? Well, it costs about a factor of 10 too much for a utility company to really give this serious notice. If you put it on a roof or whatever, it only costs a factor of 3 too much. In fact, we're looking in a new energy building that we're building in collaboration with UC Berkeley. We want to install some solar panels. We're talking BP into donating those solar modules. We can borrow money for the installation costs and the other infrastructure at 3.6% interest from the state of California, and the payback period so far is turning out to be about 20 years. Free modules, almost free money, 20 years. That's where the costs are. Think about efficiency. Anyway, what's nice about this is a Moore's law curve. This is a logarithmic curve. So the cost from here, well, let me say from 10,000 to 1,000, this is a factor of 10 drop in costs. And so photovoltaics have dropped by a factor of 10 in a roughly 2.5 decades. And once you're on this so-called Moore's law curve, you actually rarely get off of it until the technology saturates. And so in another 20 or 30 years, 25 years, we can expect the cost of photovoltaics to drop by another factor of 10, which is what we need. But that's using present incremental improvements in technologies. And this is why we need better inventions. Because you don't have to be an expert. The same slopes are for photovoltaic, windmills, and gas turbines until they began to saturate. And so it's something like this that says we need investments in more forward-looking research to generate a new starting point for a new Moore's law curve. Okay, let me talk about biofuels. The idea is you capture, she's looking more and more nervous, sunlight, turn it into biomass and turn it into energy. Now, there's a lot of discussions about the cost of production of biofuels, the shift in land resources have driving up food prices. In part, that is true. There's also, for example, the people in China are eating twice as much meat as they did 10 years ago. And in terms of land use, raising crops to feed animals is about a factor 7 to 10 more inefficient. There are impacts of weather, which could be climate, but the cost of energy is also intimately tied to the cost of food. This is the real price of food, the inflation-adjusted price. And you might ask yourself, what happened here? I remind you what happened here. That was the first oil crisis. An oil crisis generated an increase in the price of food when you didn't have the other factors like biofuels production. So it's a complicated economic problem. We want to raise grasses. We do not want to use soybeans for diesel oil or corn for ethanol. That is not a good use of land use. It's just simply not right. This is a grass. You cut this down in the fall time, and this is how much grows in the following growing season, but without irrigation and without fertilizer, which are huge energy inputs. This young lady is a graduate student who happens to be 5'3", just in case you're wondering if she's 2'4". These plants require far less energy inputs. If we get the technology right, it could be carbon beneficial by a factor of 5 from fossil fuel. Corn is barely break even in terms of carbon. It's barely break even in terms of the energy inputs to generating ethanol. And so this you can get a factor of 5. And this is why BP is investing $500 million, not to raise corn, but to develop a new technology. This is why the Department of Energy is investing $25 million a year in us also for the same thing. I'm not going to go into what we're doing because you're looking very nervous. I will just simply say that there are many things we are trying to do. We want to break down the cellulose much more economically. We want to breed better plants that can grow even better and can be broken down more easily. And we also want to replace yeast, because what happens with yeast? You take simple sugars like glucose, you feed them to yeast, and they make alcohol. It's a 5,000-year-old technology. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we can take a little critter like this bacteria and have it chomp on the complex sugars like cellulose directly and not make ethanol, which, you know, I'd rather drink, but you can make diesel fuel or airplane fuel, which has a much, much higher energy density. And so Jay Kiesling has used these E. coli to make a new antimalarial drug. He has finished this project, handed it off to a new startup company to do this with a delivery in end of 2008, 2009 at 25 cents a cure for malaria. The same technology can be used to make gasoline or diesel fuel, and in the first 6 months of the beginning of this new research institute funded by the Department of Energy, that has happened. Now, we have to get the yield up because just getting it to happen in the laboratory doesn't really mean anything. But the yield for this antimalarial drug has been increased by a factor of 100, 10, 6, 7, 7, 10 to the 8, 10 to the 8, so 10 billion. This will have to be increased by about 100 billion or more. But say 100 billion would be good enough. And so the first 8 orders of magnitude are there. In the end, we've got to do something more. We've got to imitate nature, just as these are sketches from Leonardo da Vinci, looking at wanting to fly, looking at birds, getting inspiration from birds. The idea is you strap yourself into this, you jump off a cliff, and you go like that. Rumor has it Leonardo da Vinci was just strictly theoretical at this part. But the first powered airplane flight was not muscle power, it was a hybrid solution. The wings, this is a Wright brothers plane, were made to warp like bird wings, but the propulsion was a gasoline engine. And so now our 747s don't look anything like birds. They really don't. They're single crystal jet planes. Now, they don't mate and lay little 747 eggs. They grow up to big 40s. It's okay. You can't have everything. It's probably, I surmise, just as a non-biological expert, birds don't have large vertical stabilizers, but 747s do. So it may have something to do with why 747s don't make baby 747s. Anyway, so what we want to do is use nature as an inspiration. This is the photosynthetic process in a membrane in a leaf of a plant, and make artificial photosynthesis using materials that nature cannot make. Why do we want to do this? Because we think we can make it more efficiently, And not only that, we can use every precious drop of water. Maybe 1/1000th of all the drops of water go into a fuel in the end. Whereas if we can make it artificially, maybe 10% can go into the fuel. And water is a huge, important resource, and we don't have enough of it going forward. Now, if we had a lot of energy, we could make fresh water, but you know, it's very integrated. So anyway, let me end on a happy note. Does this sound like a happy note? This is something that Paul Ehrlich wrote in 1968, The Population Bomb, and he was predicting that hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in the 70s and 80s, despite any crash program. So what happened? Let me remind you what happened. This is when the book went to press. This is the amount of land put under cultivation in the world to raise grains, corn, wheat, rice, etc. This is the productivity yield of the world. The amount of land use was about flat, but the productivity increased by a factor of 4. And it's because of the Green Revolution. Norman Borlaug et al. Were able to breed plants, not genetically modify in the new sense, but genetically modify in the 5,000-year-old sense, breed plants that quadrupled the production in India and Pakistan and Mexico. And so that prevented the mass starvations, and the population grew from 3 to 6.5 billion people. 50 years before that, we were able to synthesize ammonia and then make artificial fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizers, that prevented another mass starvation that was predicted at the turn of the century, the previous century, going into the 20th century. So I want to end on the note of this is a very precious world that we live on. This is Earthrise. This is the moon. Looks like a not uninviting place to live. And you notice there's nothing around. So there's nowhere else to go. So we really have to take care of the Earth. But technology can perhaps offer solutions. The most optimistic note is when I was a child, we thought that this exponential growth in population would not stop until essentially starvation limited the growth. What we find today is that the world population will be limited perhaps to 9.5 billion people. Each successive year, the estimate goes down where it will peak. It's a wonderful thing of optimism because what we find is the best birth control is economic prosperity. Tied in with education of women, tied in with infant mortality, tied in with all of these things, economic prosperity, and rich people to fewer babies. We don't know why, but it cuts across every culture. And if we can raise the economic standard of the world, they'll have fewer babies. I personally think it has something to do with late-night TV. But, but that's another hope of optimism, that you don't keep control of the Earth's resource and population by letting people starve to death. You actually increase their standard of living, and it takes care of itself. All right, with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Dr. Chu, thank you so much for that vision of optimism and the indication of paths that we may take to get there. I think we may have time for one question. So if you have a question, please go to that microphone so that it's recorded. And meanwhile, I think the next panel will be getting ready to come up. Does anyone want to take advantage?
Well, that's okay.
Okay, well,
All right.
thank you very much.
Okay.
It's an honor to have you here.